Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you to those on Zoom who are participating virtually. The Rutgers Computer and Technology Journal, Law Journal, would like to thank you for coming to this event. When we set out to create this symposium, we wanted to create an event that was not only related to computers and technology, that was also topical and interesting for a large group of people. We believe that there's no better time than now to seriously consider the environmental impacts of human action as we move toward an ever-automated society. Artificial intelligence has become a controversial issue in more ways than one, and with the growing adoption of AI across industries, it is critical to ensure that environmental impacts are not sidelined in the broader conversation. As we move forward, it is important that lawyers, lawmakers, organizers, and others consider the toll that artificial intelligence infrastructure takes on our environment. Today's program will feature a lecture from water policy specialist Peyton McCauley and a lunch and learn with Professor David Kemp. These two speakers will explore these issues from multiple perspectives based on their respective forthcoming articles with the journal. In this first program, Peyton McCauley, a water policy specialist at the Center for Water Policy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's School of Freshwater Sciences, will present findings from her co-authored article on the hidden environmental costs of data centers with a particular emphasis on water consumption. Drawing on original research, Peyton's lecture will examine how, despite widespread corporate sustainability pledges, data on the environmental impacts of these centers remains largely obscured from public view. The lecture will underscore data centers' significant reliance on natural resources and the urgent need for greater transparency and data accessibility from both corporations and government agencies at the state and federal level. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Peyton McCauley.
Morning, everyone, and thank you all for having me here today. As Ian said, I am Peyton McCauley. I am a recent law graduate of the Marquette University Law School, and I'm a water policy specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Center for Water Policy. I spent the last few months looking into data centers and AI and their effects on the environment, and I'm happy to be presenting my research people here. So just to kind of give you guys an overview of my talk, I will start off first by giving some intro and background on data centers and AI and how AI fits in with my larger talk. My talk is going to focus mostly on data centers, but the two are very interconnected and related. So I'll next talk about what is known currently about the environmental footprint of data centers and AI. This is coming more so from news articles and journalists. Given my location in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is right off of Lake Michigan, the Great Lakes are a resource of interest for me and the Center for Water Policy. And so this is actually where our research began, starting to look at the impacts of data centers on the Great Lakes. So I'll give some background information on that and kind of put our research into perspective. I would then go on to discuss our research methods, follow these up with a couple case studies, and then of course, I'll end with our overall findings and conclusions. So just to start off with some background, a data center is a facility that contains IT infrastructure, such as servers, routers, and storage systems. These are essential for us to do many of our everyday tasks, such as sending emails, surfing the web, storing our photos and videos, streaming music and shows, and so much more. These facilities become more and more important as our technological demands increase. And as our demands grow, so does the data center industry. The United States is a leader in the number of data centers worldwide, having over 5,000 data centers. To put that into context, the next country with the second most number of data centers is Germany, with a little over 500. Northern Virginia within the US has the highest concentration of data centers with over 300 data centers. Data centers require a lot of energy and a lot of water to operate. And the resource demand grows just as our technology demands grow. AI is a major contributor of that. Data centers are necessary for AI to operate, and without data centers, AI would not be possible. We would not be able to use anything for AI or any of the things that it provides us. AI, according to reporters, is responsible for the recent spikes in the most recent years for data centers and their resource demands. So I next want to give a little bit information about cooling technology because this plays a very large role in the amount of resources that a data center consumes. So data centers generate a lot of heat over their daily operations. So you can kind of imagine like your laptops or your phone and how they kind of overheat. So there needs to be some sort of cooling system to prevent overheating of the data center. There are a few different types of cooling systems that are out there being used for data centers, one being air cooling. This system works by channeling the heat that comes out of the data center up into the top of the facility. And this is basically going to be circulated throughout the facility, and it's going to be cool. So in this first image right over here, the hot air from the servers is pushed through into what is basically an AC unit, where it mixes with cool air and it's cooled down and then pumped right back out into these cool air or these cool aisles that are going to cool the servers. The second figure basically showing the same thing, with the only difference being that as opposed to in the first one, the hot air stays within the facility. In the second image, the hot air, at least some of it is going to be pushed outside of the facility, and what is left is going to go into a mixing room to meet cold air. And that cold air is not coming from an AC unit, but rather from the outside air, from outside the facility. So this is going to be more climate dependent and weather dependent. And then once that water or that air is cooled, it's going to go back into the cool aisles and then cool down the servers. The next type would be a water cooled system. And as the name suggests, it uses water to cool the servers as opposed to air. There are two different types of cooling systems that are water cooled: closed loop and evaporative. In the closed loop system, which is pictured right here. So in this system, the hot air from the servers is going to be on the outside of these images. It circulates and rises to this heat exchanger right here. And here it's going to mix with cold air or cold water. And the cold water is going to cool that air and absorb the heat. So once that water absorbs the heat, that warm water circulates to the top, which are at the top, there are going to be chillers that are air cooled, and this is going to cool down the water. And once that water is cooled, it's going to circulate back to the heat exchanger here and then push back out into this cool aisle to cool the servers. And so this system is closed, and so the water that is within it, it's going to be used over and over and over again. In the next image, this is the evaporative system. And the only difference that's going to be for here is once the water is cooled, or once the water absorbs the heat from the hot air, the system is going to warm it to its point where it's going to evaporate and is released into basically outside of the building. And so now that this water that has now turned to steam has been released, the system is going to have to get refilled, and so pumped back with cool water, and that cool water is going to circulate back to that heat exchanger and cool the warm air from the servers and push out that cold air. And then just to note, this system does need to be refilled with cool water, and so as you can imagine, this is going to use a lot more water than the closed system. Cooling systems are generally what make data centers so resource intensive. Whether that's going to be air cooled or water cooled, they're going to use a lot of electricity or a lot of water. So next, I will kind of give some background on what we know based on news and journalists of the environmental footprint of data centers. So data centers must be online at all times to meet our constant demand for our constant technology demands. In 2022, data centers accounted for about 3% of the US electricity use, a figure that is expected to grow to reach about 8% in 2030. So this number doesn't actually seem like a lot, but when you zoom into those areas that are hosting these facilities, a very different picture is painted. So take Virginia, for instance, which has the most data centers in the United States. So Virginia is home to 13% of the world's data center operational capacity and 25% of the Americas. Data centers in Virginia use almost the same amount of energy that's required to power about 60% of all the homes in the state. With the growth of the industry in AI, facilities may need to use up to 1 gigawatt of power or more at their peak demand. And to put that into perspective, a year of this level of consumption is twice as much as Pittsburgh's residential consumption in 2023. So as we can see, this is not very sustainable. And currently, with the renewable energy that we have today, it's too intermittent to reach the constant demands of data centers. And then against environmental goals, we're seeing us turning back to fossil fuels to meet these demands. So for example, in Omaha, Nebraska, there was a coal power plant that was previously slated to be decommissioned, but has now been extended. The lifespan of this power plant has been extended to meet the energy demands of data centers that have become operational in the area. So data centers are also very water intensive and use a lot of water. Data centers are one of the top water consuming industries, most of its water going towards water or its cooling systems. It's estimated that a mid-sized data center uses around 300,000 gallons of water a day, which is about as much as 1,000 households. So kind of tying that back into AI as well, using AI to draft a 100-word email can use somewhere between half a bottle to 3 bottles of water, depending on the location of that data center. And to even get to that point of drafting that email or doing any of the functions that we use AI for, you have to train AI. And so a team of researchers actually estimated that about 22 million liters of water were used just to train Meta's AI model. And you can understand how this growth in the industry in AI uses is going to threaten environmental goals and our sustainability goals. So as I previously mentioned, the Great Lakes are a specific topic of interest for us at the Center for Water Policy, but not just for us, these are a very important resource for many, as they are a multi-state and multinational resource bordering 8 different US states and Canada as well. The Great Lakes are the world's largest freshwater resource, holding about 85% of the world's freshwater. The Great Lakes region has a relatively cool climate, and this, as well as the abundance of water, makes the Great Lakes an attractive location for the hot and thirsty data centers. So knowing this, we set out to understand the implications of data centers in expanding into the Great Lakes region. And so in the last slide, I kind of gave some figures and some facts, but this is based, as I said, on news articles and journalists. And so our research, we wanted to do a more academic study of this. Moving on to my research methods. We used a number of different tactics to assess the potential impacts of data centers. For one, because this is what we would think would be public information, the resource consumption. We started with government and public records to try to analyze the water supply and discharge of data centers, hoping to use this information to build a more complete picture of the water use of data centers. We also tried to analyze this question from the private sector of things, looking into company ESG and sustainability reports. Lastly, we looked at 2 different case studies, in particular to get a better understanding of the topic. So the first study is a data center in Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin, that is currently under construction. And the second case study is going to look at Fauquier County in Northern Virginia, just to see how they've dealt with this issue. And so the next 2 slides are going to give more details of each different tactic we tried to use to research this, as well as our findings. So starting off with water supply. One way we tried to assess the demands of data center was by looking at the water supply of things and how much water initially goes into a data center. A data center can either be self-supplied, using water through ground wells or intake pipes running directly to a water body. Alternatively, data centers receive water from water utilities. So this image actually has, this will be the data center right here, and this is going to be the water utility. So the water utility is going to draw water from a water source and send that over to a data center just needing the water. So to do this, we first had to research and identify different data centers that we might be interested in learning this information for. Once we found that information, or which data centers we wanted to look into, we then had to verify what utility would be supplying each data center. Then we would have to draft and send a records request to each utility, requesting the information for each individual facility. So we did this for Virginia, and we actually got responses back from Virginia that per their state law, we were actually not entitled to receive this information because we were not residents. So only residents in Virginia can receive this type of information, which not necessarily is the case in every state. And so therefore, we just weren't able to get any information from the utilities, and that just kind of highlights one of the barriers we face trying to get this information. Another way we tried to assess this information was looking at the Great Lakes Regional Water Use Database. So the Great Lakes have a compact that helps states to work together to manage and protect the lakes. As part of the compact, withdrawals over 100,000 gallons a day must be reported, and the Great Lakes Regional Database helps to facilitate this effort. So there are data managers in each of the Great Lakes states that report these withdrawals to the national body, and the withdrawals are tracked and recorded in the database. So we try to use this database to assess any withdrawals from the Great Lakes by data centers. So once you actually go into that database, there are very broad categories that talk about their withdrawal. So you'll see categories such as industrial or commercial. And once you try to actually analyze this, you're only going to get the aggregate of those individual industries. There's no breakdown for individual facilities, and there are no subcategories even to look at. So we weren't able to see anything that was data center specific from that database. So we then reached out to the data managers of each state to see if they knew any information about any data centers that were using the water from the Great Lakes, and if so, how much. The majority of the responses we received from the data managers were that if there were any data centers in the Great Lakes Basin, they were not drawing directly from a water source, but instead being supplied by a water utility. The data managers could also only see what was being reported from the data or the water utilities in aggregate. They couldn't actually see who the utilities were supplying. So for us to get any information specific on data centers, we would then have to contact the utility directly, request that specific information. And this would be a very similar process of what we did in Virginia, identifying the different data centers we were interested in, figure out what water utilities are going to supply them, and then sending out those requests. And you can see how this would be a very long and tedious process. So moving on to water discharge. Another way we try to assess data center water use was by looking at the discharge. So generally, once a data center was supplied with any water and they consume their water, they're going to have some leftover wastewater that needs to be discharged. The data center will either send it straight to a water source, or breaking up that picture from the last slide again, the data center right here, they would send their water to what is a wastewater treatment facility, and they're going to treat the water and put it back into a water source. So if a data center is going to discharge straight to a water source, it would need a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit, which is also known as a NPDES permit. And this is required by the Clean Water Act. Those facilities that need a NPDES permit must also submit a discharge monitoring report, also known as a DMR, which basically helps to determine whether or not the facility is operating within the bounds of their NPDES permit. As part of that DMR, flow amount needs to be reported. And so we were hoping that this would be a good way to at least see how much water the data center was discharging by looking at those DMRs and seeing how much flow was being reported to the discharge from the facility. And we understand that this will only be a single piece of the puzzle. We wouldn't get the full picture, but at least give us somewhere to start, at least seeing how much is being discharged. And then, of course, knowing there's probably more that's going to the facility and being used. So the EPA manages a database called ECHO, which tracks the compliance of facilities that have NPDES permits and their associated DMR information. So we're hoping to use this database to find relevant information for data centers. But what we did find was that this information was not actually available for data centers in the database. So this is an image or screenshot of one of the DMR, a piece of the DMR report that's supposed to be flow for a data center. So as you can see right across the top, there's just these ends right across the top. And basically this is showing us that there's nothing that's actually being reported. So even though they said there is a DMR report for the data center, once you get into that DMR report, there is no actual information there that's being reported. We were hoping to find at least something like this, where you can see down at the bottom, there are actual data points. Up here, there might be nothing's being reported. But this was not the case. We tried to analyze the database looking at other industries that we knew were going to be using that needed NPDES reports and a DMR. So this is a screenshot from a power plant. And so for the most part, we were actually able to see this information for other industries, just not data centers. So based on this information, we thought that maybe it was due because data centers were not actually discharging directly to a water body, but instead to a water facility. So those utilities probably had those NPDES permits and their DMR information in ECHO and not the data centers. If they're going to be discharging into a treatment facility, though, they're still going to need a permit under the CWA. And this is a pre-treatment permit. So like a NIPSEA's permit, these pre-treatment permits are accompanied with another monitoring report that also track flow along with other parameters. But these reports are not tracked and kept in a central database like NIPSEA's or their DMR information. And so one will have to go in and request the specific facilities, the specific wastewater facilities, and the corresponding wastewater treatment facilities to get this information. Again, that would be another long, tedious process of identifying the data centers, finding the treatment facilities that are supporting them, and then going through and actually submitting those record requests. So our key takeaways from this approach is that searching government and public records was not as helpful as we thought it would be. It's a very fragmented approach. We had to break it up between supply and discharge. And even if we were able to find that information, we still have to do some further research or calculations to see how much the data centers were actually consuming. It's an incomplete approach. As you saw with the ECHO database, even if they do have, or they're listed to have the information, it may or may not actually be there. And then again, it can require many records requests to actually get the information. So another method we tried to assess data center resource use was through ESG reports. So ESG reporting is a part of private governance, which is driven by NGOs rather than with public governance, which is actually based in the government. Because of its private nature, ESG reporting is not necessarily required nor accessible to the public. Nonetheless, many companies voluntarily release these reports to the public. Sustainable operations have become a very important and major part of major corporations, and ESG reports are a way for companies to showcase their sustainable efforts and progress. ESG reports or sustainability reports look at other aspects of the company aside from their financials. And so though many companies do release these, they are voluntary, and the level of detail can differ depending on the company. We looked at 6 of the top top companies with data centers: Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Digital Realty, and Equinix from the years 2019 to 2023. Meta and Google were among the 2 top companies with the most detailed reporting, especially with respect to their data centers. So we did a deep dive into their reports to see if we can analyze at least their resource use based on their data centers. So the next couple slides will kind of discuss our findings on that and our findings of what was in their reports. So this slide is some screenshots of the, we created charts based on the reports for Meta. And we found that Meta actually gives a breakdown of their electricity and water use by its data centers. Basically, what you need to know from this slide is the total amount of electricity that is being consumed increases every year operationally, and then the data centers are using around 95%, if not more, of the electricity that's being used across the operations for Meta. A similar story exists for their water use. Water use operationally across Meta, it increases every year, and the data centers are using around 99% a lot of times of the water that's being used across that entire company. Google, unlike Meta, only provides information for their water consumption that's specific to its data centers and not its electricity consumption. But you can still see that here, the global use of water across Google is going to increase again every year. And the data centers are using, again, a very, very large proportion of that. So our key takeaways from this is, one, that we are seeing that the resource demands of companies are increasing every year. Data centers are responsible for a majority of the resource demands. And then I also want to bring back that AI is a very large contributor to that, especially in the recent years. And then lastly, that ESG reporting, though it does offer more information that we were able to find with the public documents, there were still quite a few gaps. As you can see with Google, that does not release its electricity consumption for its data centers. So turning to one of our case studies, I mentioned the Great Lakes Compact a bit earlier, which is an agreement between the Great Lakes states and how they will manage and protect the lakes. the compact does not allow for any new diversions or water to be withdrawn outside of the basin. So basically, any water that is in the Great Lakes, they want to keep there. So they don't want any movement across watersheds. But there are a few exceptions which have to be applied for and receive government approval. So Microsoft is building a data center in Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin, which is right over here, this kind of like greenish white shaded area. And the data center is going to be built right here. So this red line dictates the watershed basin. So everything over to this side, like right on the right side, is going to be within the basin of Lake Michigan, and everything to this side is going to be outside of the basin. So the location within Mount Pleasant that the data center is going to be built is outside of the basin. Mount Pleasant borders the city right over here, which is Racine, which is right off of Lake Michigan. And Lake Michigan, the water from Lake Michigan is used by Racine and supplied over to Mount Pleasant through a longstanding agreement. So before this data center was actually kind of coming into construction, the site that the data center we built was supposed to be a location of another large facility that was going to require a lot of water. As part of planning for that facility, the company applied for one of the Great Lake Compact exceptions to receive water from Racine, which got approved. But ultimately, the project fell through. Microsoft came in, scooped up the site area, and the plan is to move forward with the same approval, which amounts to a diversion of 7 million gallons of water a day. We don't actually know if this amount of water is going to be used by the data center, and so this was one of the questions we wanted to analyze, along with a little bit of the electricity demands of the data center. So knowing this information, we inquired into the energy and electricity, or the water demands, and we could not find anything from the news, at least. So we first reached out to Mount Pleasant, but they didn't have any estimates for us regarding water or electricity use. So we then contacted Racine Water Utility and received a response that though what we thought would be public information, they said it was confidential and that we should contact Microsoft. We then contacted Microsoft, but their response was not very substantive and still left a lot of questions for us. So we then tried to turn to Microsoft ESG reports, but Microsoft is not very forthcoming with their information regarding their data centers. They share their aggregate global operations for their water and electricity use, but nothing specific to the data centers. And so their reports were not very helpful for us and for our purposes. So basically, the resource demands of this data center could not be determined. And this is an important thing to realize because, one, the public can't have any information and they can't provide any meaningful feedback for these type of projects that are going to go through in their neighborhoods. It also hinders the ability of the government officials to fully assess the impacts of the project and whether or not this is going to be the type of project they want to go forward with in their localities. So our last case study is going to be Fauquier County in Northern Virginia. So Fauquier County borders Loudoun and Fairfax, which are both very densely populated with data centers. But Fauquier County has somehow resisted the boom with only 2 operating data centers as of October 2024. We think that this appears to be due at least to their ordinances. So based on their ordinances, data centers operating with a closed loop cooling system, which I discussed a little bit earlier, they are generally permitted in the county. Furthermore, there is this special exception application that applies to both buildings that are greater than 50,000 square feet in size and to data centers that are not using closed loop cooling. The special exception gives the county's board of supervisors complete authority over whether to approve a project, including the ability to reject without any cost. These ordinances act in a way to favor smaller sized data centers using closed loop technology, which are those facilities that can generally move forward without the special exception review. So given the limited number of data centers that are operational in the county, and that this is the data center capital of the world, one may be able to assume that if a board does not like or disfavors data centers, the ability to reject without cause has played a very large role in maintaining the county's rural nature. And this example just highlights that once the environmental impacts of a data center is understood, there are ways to control and regulate them. So in conclusion, some of our findings are, one, that energy and water demands pose a significant threat to the environment. There is a very clear lack of accessibility and transparency regarding the resource use of these data centers. And we think this information needs to be made more available to the public. Clear information on resource demands is essential. One, to inform the public and to inform government officials in regarding whether or not they need to go forward and approve these type of facilities. We also think that sustainable practices need to be prioritized. Renewable energy, we need to find a way to make these less intermittent so they can actually meet the demands of data centers. And then also looking for other technologies such as the closed loop cooling this closed loop cooling, which is actually used in Fauquier County. I didn't mention in the last slide, the closed loop cooling is actually, since it's being used in Fauquier County does not have any large concerns regarding water use. And so we can see that that closed loop cooling is actually playing a very large part in how much water the data centers are using. But there is some sort of trade-off between water use and electricity use. So again, prioritizing renewable energy for electricity demands, and more technology that's going to help limit the water use of these data centers. And with that, I want to say thank you all, and I'm happy to open up to any questions y'all may have.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I thought it was really excellent. Do the data centers, I assume they're using potable water for cooling?
For the most part, they are, yes.
Could they use gray water instead?
I'm not 100% sure. It does seem like they're trying to kind of like have those more like filter type of water. So I think there's like issues with like maybe there's like mineral buildup and things like that that might kind of mess with their systems. But for the most part, it seems like a lot of them are using potable water.
Excuse me, I've heard two schools of thought when it comes to less holding the government accountable for things like that. Do you think that in your experience that it would be recommended for institutions to kind of continue to discount them as data that should be accessible? It's better to go to balance if not
My personal opinion, I think it's good to kind of like get on the government to make this information more accessible. I think, at least from our research even though these companies are disclosing some of this information, you can't force them to do anything if it's voluntary. So if the government can make it a way to at least make it more transparent so the public can have this information and government officials actually know what's going on, I think that would be the best way to move forward with this industry.
Sorry, I'm very into this subject, but I'm just curious, knowing that addressing the issue of like water consumption and water supply going to possibly increase the issue of our electricity because we haven't led to that renewable energy. How does that play into designing like water policy and policy just around the consumption of electricity and water, like, because you want to address one issue, but it kind of is increasing a different issue because it's not being addressed simultaneously. So how does that function or work in regards to having discussions with government officials and policy making and so on?
That is an excellent question. I don't know if I have a great answer for that because there is that trade-off, and I don't know if there's quite a way to make sure we can think of the changes at the same time. But I think at least addressing one, though it might, kind of offset the demands for another one, I think addressing one, at least in the meantime, will, kind of get the ball rolling. And in the long term, obviously, we want to be able to have renewable energy and water and cooling systems that are going to, reduce the amount of demand that we're having. But I don't know if there's quite necessarily a way that we can do that all at the same time and have a very smooth transition to it. Yes.
No question. I came a little bit late, so I apologize if you may have gone over this in the presentation, but are there any countries that we can explore that have, like a standard for water policy that we can?
I can't say that my research has branched out outside of the United States. It's also probably really hard to make that decision just because the United States has so many more data centers than any other country. You may or may not have been here when I had mentioned that the United States has over 5,000 data centers, and the country with the next amount is Germany with just over 300. So I don't know if there's necessarily going to be a country we can look to that's going to be able to address the volume of demands that we're having, because they just have such a smaller number and significant lower of data centers, and probably a lot less resource use because of that.
One more question. I assume that the closed loop systems are more expensive to run, that's why most data centers don't use that, is that accurate?
I'm not 100% sure if that is necessarily the case. What I have been seeing is that it just kind of depends on the location of whether they're going to use one type of cooling mechanism over the other. We have seen that there are a lot of data centers that are going to be put into actually regions that are very scarce with water, but that's actually due because their electricity is a lot cheaper over there. So take the Western United States, for instance. And they have a little bit more access to renewable energy. But it just kind of depends on where they're going to put the data center on whether they're going to use closed loop or evaporative cooling. One I know is going to be the cost of electricity. I think another one is going to be if they have access to the electricity grid. In Northern Virginia, they're kind of starting to tap out that electricity grid. And so they're probably going to have to start branching out to the other areas where they can hook up and have some more reliable energy. I think those are two of the largest and the main factors of where they're going to place these facilities.
Thank you for your answer. What are some residents' concerns, I guess, that you've seen the research that live near these areas?
Yeah, so a lot of it is going to be one, like if they're going to be in the area, it's just a very unsightly thing to have in your backyard. Another concern is the amount of noise that these things are making with especially if they're going to be air cooled, the humming of that AC unit, it could be heard for miles. And so I think those are two of the main issues that the residents, at least in the areas, are concerned about. Thank you.